How the Fairy Violet Lost and Won Her Wings by Marianne L.B. Kerr. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jenn Broda. The Fairy Violet lived in the heart of a beautiful forest, where, through the glad spring months, the sun shone softly and the bright flowers bloomed, and now and then the gentle rain fell in silver drops that made every green thing on which they rested fresher and more beautiful still. At the foot of a stately oak nestled a clump of violets, and it was there the wee fairy made her home. She wore a robe of deep violet, and her wings, which were of the most delicate gauze, glistened like dewdrops in the sun. All day long she was busy at work tending her flowers, bathing them in the fresh morning dew, painting them anew with her delicate fairy brush, or loosening the clay when it pressed too heavily upon their fragile roots. And at night she joined the elves in their merry dance upon the greensward. She was not alone in the great forest. Near her were many of her sister fairies, all old friends and playmates. There was the fairy Primrose in a gown of pale yellow, and Cowslip, who wore a robe of the same color but a deeper shade. There was the graceful Bluebell, and the wild Anemone, the delicate Wood Sorrel, and the yellow Kingcup. The fairy Bluebell wore a robe the color of the sky on a calm summer's day. Anemone and Wood Sorrel were clad in pure white, while Kingcup wore a gown of bright amber. One day, as the Fairy Violet was resting from the noonday heat on the open leaves of her favorite flower, a noisy troop of boys, just set free from school, came dashing at full speed through the forest. "Hullo! There is a nest in that tree," cried one, and he trod ruthlessly on the violets as he sprang up the trunk of the ancient oak. The Fairy Violet was thrown to the ground with a shock that left her for a time stunned and motionless. When she recovered, the boys were gone, and the flower in which she had been resting lay crushed and dying on the ground. Filled with tender pity at the sight, Fairy Violet hastened to tend her wounded charge, taking no thought of her own injuries. "Dear Violet, be comforted," she whispered softly as she raised the drooping flower from the ground. "I will try to make you well." Then she took her fairy goblet and fetched a few drops of dew from a shady place which the sun had not yet reached, to revive the fainting flower, and bound up the broken stem with a single thread of her golden hair. But it was all in vain, and the fairy, after wrapping an acorn in soft moss and placing it for a pillow beneath the head of the fast-fading violet, left it to try her skill on the other flowers. A faint fragrance from the dying flower thanked her as she turned sadly away to pursue her labor of love. It was not until she had raised and comforted all the drooping flowers and bound up their wounds that the Fairy Violet thought of herself. Then she discovered that her delicate gossamer wings were gone. Evidently they had been caught on a crooked stick as she fell to the ground and torn violently off, for there the remnants now hung, shriveled and useless, flapping in the breeze. At this sight, the hapless fairy threw herself by the side of the now withered violet and wept bitterly. When spring and the spring flowers were gone and their work was ended, Violet and her sister fairies had been wont to spread their wings and fly back to fairyland, to report to the queen what they had done, and to receive from her reward or blame, according as they had performed their task well or ill. Now this happy prospect was over for poor Violet. "I shall never see fairyland again," she muttered, and wept anew at the thought. The violets, whom she had tended so lovingly, were very sorry for her grief, and shook their heads gently in the breeze, till their fragrance filled the air and stole softly round the weeping fairy. But though they comforted, they could not help her. Presently she rose and glided swiftly through the tall grass, till she reached the flower where the blue-robed fairy was resting after her day's work. "Oh, Sister Bluebell," she cried, "I have lost my wings. Where shall I get another pair, that I may fly back to Fairyland with you and my sisters when our work is done?" Then Bluebell shook her head sorrowfully, till all her sweet bells chimed. "I am sorry, I am sorry." But she could not help her sister Violet. "Perhaps Cowslip will know," she suggested. But Cowslip bade her try what Woodsorrel would say, and Woodsorrel thought perhaps Kingcup might know. So Violet went from one to another till she was ready to cry again with vexation. Then all the fairies gathered round her and tried to comfort her. "Let us ask the owl that sits in the hollow oak," said the gentle anemone, gliding to Violet's side. "He must be very wise, for he never smiles and seldom speaks more than 3 words at a time." So that night, when the moon lit her silver lamp in the sky, instead of dancing, as was their wont, with the elves upon the greensward, they all repaired to the hollow oak to seek an audience of the owl. They had to repeat their errand 2 or 3 times before he understood it, for the owl was as slow of understanding as he was of speech. And then, having nodded his head solemnly for 5 minutes and winked and blinked for quite 10, he said solemnly, "Try the King of the Fire Spirits." After which he relapsed into silence and obstinately refused to say any more. Then the Fairy Violet bade farewell to all her friends and set out on her journey to the King of the Fire Spirits. She had a long way to go, for the Fire King held his court in the very center of the earth, and she might have lost herself in the dark passages had not the glowworm lent her his lamp. She had saved him once when a hungry bird would have carried him off in her beak, and from that time the glowworm had loved the gentle fairy, and always burned brightest when she was by. The Fairy Violet traveled very quickly, scarcely touching her feet to the ground, but passing onward with a swift gliding motion that was very beautiful. Still, it was 3 days and 3 nights before she reached the kingdom of the fire spirits, for she had 4,000 miles to go. Had she not been a fairy, she must have been scorched to death as she entered the Fire King's domain, for the streets were paved with molten iron, and flames kept bursting forth in all directions, in which she could perceive strange wild figures, some leaping to and fro in mad fantastic glee, playing at ball with lumps of burning coal, others manufacturing volcanic fire in their monstrous furnaces. They ceased their employment when they saw Violet, and came and knelt before her in wondering admiration. She looked so beautiful as she came floating towards them in her soft violet robe, with her fair hair rippling in golden waves to her very feet, that they thought she might be an angel who had strayed down from among the bright stars to their gloomy dwelling place, for they had never seen a fairy before. They were moved with compassion when they heard her sad tale, and at once led her before their king, who was seated on a throne of molten gold, with red and yellow flames curling up and arching over him for a canopy, and a crown of fire on his head. He looked rather fierce, but received Violet very graciously, and at once ordered his head blacksmith to make the little fairy a new pair of wings. Violet was a little startled when she found that these were made of fire and were to be fastened on her shoulders with bands of liquid gold, but the king assured her that they were the very best of their kind. "There is nothing so powerful as fire," he cried with a fierce, exultant laugh, waving his fiery scepter in the burning atmosphere so wildly that though Violet thought he had been very kind to her and bade him a very grateful farewell, she was yet not at all sorry to be safely out of his domains. How fresh and green the earth looked as she emerged from the dark caverns that led to the Fire King's palace and rested her hot feet on the cool grass. But when, eager to tell her friends of her success, she began to try the Fire King's present, a general cry of dismay and terror broke forth. "Sister Violet, you are killing our flowers!" cried the fairies reproachfully. "Oh, I am burning! I am burning!" shrieked the grass. Cruel fairy, you have killed us," murmured the insects as with scorched wings they fell helpless to the ground. "Alas," said Violet, weeping, "I am bringing death and destruction wherever I go. I will fly back to fairyland before I work more mischief." But the birds looked down from their nests, wild with terror at the thought. "You will kill us if you fly up here with your burning wings," they chirped piteously. "You will scorch us to death," shouted the trees, tossing their heads angrily in the breeze. "Ah, gentle fairy, have pity on us," cooed the dove. "Did I not comfort you when your pet Violet died? Have I not sung to you at night when you were weary with dancing?" warbled the nightingale. "Have we not sheltered you from the fierce heat of the sun and the beating of the pitiless rain?" rustled the trees indignantly. "Heartless," muttered the wind, rushing rudely past her, "to injure those you love so much." "I shall never see fairyland again," murmured Violet, but she had too gentle a heart to persist, so she sadly retraced her steps and bade the Fire King take back his fatal gift. That evening, she and her sister fairies went to the owl and told him of the ill success of her mission. The owl heard her to the end with great gravity and then said severely, "Of course, anyone with any sense would have known that wings forged by the fire spirits must burn everything they touched." Violet would have liked to remind him that it was he who bade her go to the king of the fire spirits, but he looked so very severe, and he sat blinking solemnly in the moonlight, that she was afraid and only said humbly, "Please, what shall I do now?" "Go to the king of the snow spirits, of course," said the owl, rather crossly, for he wanted to go to sleep. "If fire is too hot, you had better try snow." "Alas, what shall I do?" said Violet very sadly. "The Snow King lives far off by the North Pole, and I have no wings to bear me to him over the seas." Then a gentle fluttering was heard in the trees, and a seabird alighted at Violet's feet. "Beautiful fairy," he sang softly, "do you not remember now, 3 springs ago, when the trees were clothing themselves anew in their green raiment, and the flowers were springing up among the fresh grass, you bound up my leg, which the hunter had wounded with his cruel gun, and fed me daily with luscious fruits, and gave me to drink of sparkling dew till I recovered. I vowed then that I would one day repay you, and now my chance has come. Mount on my back, sweet Violet, and I will carry you to the Snow King." Then Violet thanked him joyfully and seated herself on his back, and the seabird flew away with her far over the hills and vales and pleasant fields, and beyond the great ocean till he reached the palace of the Snow King. The palace was built of blocks of ice, filled in with snow, and arched over with a graceful snowdrift for a roof, while lofty colonnades of snow, supported by pillars of ice, led the way to the audience chamber, which glistened with diamonds and crystals of the most sparkling brilliancy. The Snow King wore on his head a crown of ice diamonds, while from his shoulders hung gracefully a pure white cloak fringed with glittering icicles and fastened at the neck with a crystal brooch. Violet shivered a little as she entered this coldly beautiful palace, for she was accustomed to bask all day long in the warm sunshine and had never trod on anything colder than soft grass. But she quickly recovered herself, and gliding with a swift, graceful movement to the foot of the Snow King's throne, she bent on one knee before him and told him for what she had come. Then the Snow King looked kindly upon the little fairy and raised her gently with his ice-cold hands. "Beautiful fairy," he said, "you are the first of your race who has ever entered my kingdom, and never have I seen aught so radiantly lovely before. Your wish is granted. I only would it were twice as costly." And, turning to the snow spirits, who were gathering lovingly round the bright being who had ventured so boldly into their ice-bound regions, he bade them mold wings of the purest and most delicate snow for their fairy visitant. Then the king lay back on his throne and looked at the sweet, modest face of the little fairy, and at her graceful form with the bright hair rippling in sunny waves over the violet robe, till, moved by sudden impulse, he came and knelt down at Violet's feet. "Sweet fairy," he said as Violet turned her wondering eyes upon him, "I have long ruled as monarch among my snow spirits, and I have been very proud of the cold splendor of my palace, with its glittering crystals and pillars of ice. And I have laughed when the Fire King has taunted me from afar with its lack of warmth and color, for I cared not for either. But now it seems to me that the bright gleam of your golden hair and the warm glow of your violet robe are far more beautiful than my ice diamonds and sparkling crystals, and that my palace will be very bleak and desolate when you have gone. Stay with us, gentle fairy, and be my queen." Then all the snow spirits gathered eagerly round Violet and cried, "Stay with us and be our queen." Violet shivered as their icy breath blew upon her, and her hand grew cold in the Snow King's frozen clasp. But she turned to him and said very gently, for she was sorry to give him pain, "I cannot leave my beautiful fairyland to become your queen. I should pine away in your beautiful ice palace, for I love the warm sunshine and the bright flowers and the soft breath of balmy spring, and this cold air would kill me. So do not ask me again, noble king, for I cannot say yes, and it grieves me to say no." Then the Snow King urged her no more, but went back to his throne and watched her with such sad, wistful eyes that Violet's heart ached, and she was glad when they brought her the wings that she might fly away. They were very beautiful, made of soft, feathery snow, and fastened to her shoulders with crystal buckles. Violet knelt down and kissed the king's hand, thanking him gratefully for his kindness and praying him to forgive her any pain she had caused him, and then flew away side by side with her faithful bird. The Snow King watched her till the bright sheen of her hair and the soft flutter of her wings could no longer be seen, and then turned back, sad and lonely, to his palace. But Violet was very happy. "I shall see Fairyland again, bright, beautiful Fairyland," she sang softly to herself over and over. But when the frozen seas were past, and she was hovering once more above the land, the sun shone full upon her, the snow wings melted away, and she fell helplessly to the ground. "Dear Violet, are you hurt?" asked the fairy anemone, by whose side she had fallen. But Violet could not speak. She hid her face in Anemone's white robe and wept bitterly. "Dear Sister Violet," said Anemone, winding her arms lovingly round the weeping fairy, "be comforted. This night we will go together and seek an audience of the owl. Perhaps he will give us wiser counsel this time." "The owl only mocks me," said Violet. "I will not ask counsel from him again." Then Anemone was silent, for she knew not what else to advise, and only tried to show her pity by tender words and caresses. But Fairy Kingcup lifted up her bright face and said cheerily, "Why not try the Wizard of the Black Rock? He lives a long way off, but he is the wisest magician that ever lived, and if anyone can help our sister Violet, it is he." Violet shook her head sorrowfully. "I do not know the way," she said. "I will lead you," hummed a bee from the deep cup of a cowslip. "And I will sing you my merriest song to cheer you by the way," warbled a thrush, circling lovingly round her head. "And I," cried the glowworm, "will light you at night with my golden lamp." "We all love you, Fairy Violet, because you are so gentle and good," they sang in chorus, and Violet lifted her head, comforted, and smiled a sweet, joyous smile as she bade farewell to her sister fairies. It was a long journey that she undertook, for the Wizard of the Black Rock lived quite at the other end of the earth. Sometimes a benighted traveler, hurrying homewards, fancied he saw a golden light flash like lightning past his dazzled eyes, or heard a warbling of sweet music, delighting for an instant his bewildered ears. But light and music were gone in a moment, and he never guessed that it was the fairy Violet who had passed him as she glided onward with her 3 faithful attendants to seek the Wizard of the Black Rock. At length they reached the great black rock, which rose up grim and forbidding from a wide, desolate plain. The bee sank down humming cheerfully at the base, the thrush perched himself on a projecting ridge, and the glowworm hid himself behind a tuft of withered grass. Violet advanced boldly to the small black door, studded with iron nails, which was standing open, guarded only by a black dwarf of preternatural ugliness. He turned as the beautiful fairy came floating towards him and led the way silently through dark passages and up narrow, winding stairs to his master's chamber. It was a small, dark room, lighted only by a silver lamp of great brilliancy, which stood on a table by the fireplace, where, though the month was May, the weather was bright and sunny. There burned a dim, smoldering fire. The wizard, whose silvery locks contrasted strangely with the surrounding gloom, bent over a book. Its jeweled clasps were rusted with age, each page was enriched with colored tracery. He was very old. More than 100 years had elapsed since it was first rumored that a famous magician had taken up his abode in the Black Rock, and all that time he had spent in studying the great black book of magic spells that lay open before him. No wonder he was wise and learned. The dwarf shut the door with a sudden resentful clang, and Violet was left alone with the great magician. She glided to his side and knelt down meekly before him. But the wizard, deep in his abstruse studies, did not hear her, and Violet felt a sensation of awe creeping over her as she noted his abstracted gaze, and looked on the high, arched forehead wrinkled with centuries of years and study. Suddenly, the magician turned, muttering some strange words in an unknown tongue, and as he did so, his eyes fell upon Violet. A remembrance of some bygone spell of grace and beauty seemed to stir the wizard as he looked upon the bright-haired fairy, to whose upturned face the light of the silver lamp had lent a fairer radiance, for his deep voice softened as he spoke to her, and he laid his hand gently on her head while she told her story. When she had finished, he remained musing for some time in silence. "I know no spells that will serve where the spirits of snow and of fire have failed," he said at length with unwonted gentleness. "No one can help thee here but thine own loving heart. Kind words, gentle deeds, faithful service, patient waiting, from these alone can be wrought the wings which will be slight enough for thy delicate frame to bear, and yet powerful enough to withstand every trial. Go forth, then, gentle fairy, to thy daily tasks, and wait patiently till the great Mother Nature herself give thee thy reward." "Thanks, kind magician," said Violet with a bright smile. "You have given me a pleasant task to do." Then, kissing gratefully his withered hand, she went on her way, and the aged magician thought his silver lamp burned dimly, and his cell grew dark when she had left. "Could not the great wizard help you?" cried her 3 friends, sorrowfully, as gliding past the black dwarf that guarded the entrance, she stepped out into the open air. "Could he not help you?" echoed the sister fairies when she re-entered once more the old forest. "Alas, is there no help for you, sweet Violet?" wept the wind, wandering in and out among the lofty trees, rocking and swaying them like slender bulrushes in his fierce sorrow. But to each and all Violet replied only by a glad, quiet smile. "Patience," she said gently. "Mother Nature will help me in her own time." So she returned to her work among the violets, and when they had all died, and the spring had gone, and her sister fairies flew away to fairyland, she still smiled, though a little sadly, and bade them farewell without a shade of discontent in her brave, gentle voice. "Now I must find some work," she said to herself, when her wistful eyes could no longer discern the flutter of their wings in the azure sky. And she soon found plenty to do. Now it was binding up the wound of some stricken bird, or raising some crushed flower, and sprinkling its drooping leaves with cooling dew, and now it was closing the eyelids of a tired child who had thrown himself down to rest beneath the forest shade, and singing softly in his ears a fairy lullaby till he fell asleep. Sometimes she would perch herself on the shoulder of some sleeping wayfarer by the roadside, and whisper in his ear sweet and tender words that made him dream of his home and of the mother sleeping so peacefully in the churchyard far away, till he started from his sleep and went on his way with a touched and softened heart. Every day Fairy Violet found some kindly deed to do, and every day Mother Nature, looking lovingly on her child, saw the time was drawing nearer when she should receive her reward. One day as she was wandering through one of the by-streets of a crowded city, she was attracted by a plaintive voice that proceeded from one of the low-roofed, badly built houses. "Put the geranium where I can see it, Mother," the voice was saying. "I love to lie back and watch it." A woman came forward at these words and altered the position of the plant, which Fairy Violet had already noticed as being rather faded and in want of her skill to brighten the colors. "It is very washy-like," she said regretfully. "I doubt this stuffy air is killing it." "Will it live as long as I shall?" asked the plaintive voice. There was no answer, but Violet saw that the mother's hands shook as they busied themselves with the flower. "I hope it will," the voice continued with a sort of wistful eagerness. "For it is such a pleasure to me to watch it. It seems to comfort me when the pain is very bad, and I lie awake through the long weary night to look at it and wonder what the little garden is looking like in the old home you have told me of so often, Mother, and whether the moon is shining as sweetly there as over our poor house here. I sometimes wonder, too, whether the flowers there are so very much more beautiful than my poor sickly geranium, and whether if I saw them I should care for it no longer, and then I think that no flower could ever be so beautiful to me as my flower, and that I love it far better, rearing its pretty head so bravely in this dull, stuffy room, than if it bloomed in the loveliest garden that was ever planted. And many a time when I have felt a little downhearted with being a burden to you, Mother, and the pain seeming as if it was more than I could bear, it has seemed to say, 'Patience, poor little Faith, it will be over soon.' Do you think there will be flowers in heaven, Mother?" "Like enough, child," said the woman dreamily. "There will be everything that is beautiful there, I expect." And she heaved a deep sigh. Poor woman, there was little of beauty in her present life, and the country home of which her child had spoken was but a far-off recollection to her now. "I should like to have it near me when I die," the sick girl went on. "I have never had a friend, you know, Mother, but my flower has seemed to stand in the place of one to me, and I should like to look at it just at the last." "Lord love you, child! Don't talk of dying unless you want to break my heart," said the mother with a tone of sharp impatience in which there was more of grief than of anger. While she was speaking, Fairy Violet glided in at the open door. The room was poor, but scrumptiously clean, and the scanty furniture was as bright as diligent rubbing could make it. On a rude couch, opposite the open window, lay a girl of about 16 years of age, but with a wan-pinched face that made her look 10 years older. Constant pain had blanched all the color she might once have possessed, and the blue veins showed clearly through the thin, transparent skin. She turned her head as Violet entered, and a faint flush of pleasure rose on her pale cheeks. "Mother, do you smell the violets?" she exclaimed eagerly. "The room seems filled with fragrance." "It must be your fancy, child," said the woman wearily. "I smell not." By this time, Violet had settled herself in one of the blossoms of the geranium and was busy at work. "Look, look, Mother!" cried the sick girl again. "This at least is no fancy." And mother and daughter gazed at the flower in amazement as the faded color grew bright under the fairy's magic touch. "'Tis the moving it to a sunnier spot, or mayhap 'twas the water I gave it this morning," said the woman, recovering herself with a start. "I'll give it a drop more." And she bustled off to get some, while her daughter lay back and watched the flower with a quiet, restful smile on her patient lips. "There is work for me to do here," said Violet to herself, feeling quite happy as she glided from blossom to blossom, touching and retouching with her delicate brush. So she stayed, and day by day the flower grew more radiantly beautiful beneath her loving hands. Sweetest fragrance filled the room, and softest murmuring of fairy music floated on the air, which, though the dull senses of mother and daughter failed to interpret rightly, yet stole into their hearts and gave them comfort. Sometimes a vision would come before her of the radiant fairyland from which she was banished, or of her beautiful forest home where fragrant flowers had wrapped her in their dewy leaves, where birds had sung to her from the leafy bower above her head, and the bright sun had shone upon her with genial warmth. But she would quickly banish such thoughts, and gliding round the room would touch every dull corner with her fairy wand till it shone and brightened with a magic charm, would cast a spell upon the smoldering fire so that it burned and crackled cheerily, would lay her cool hand upon the sick girl's throbbing brow till the pain abated, and would cast a fairy haze before her languid eyes so that they saw beautiful visions in the changeful sky. So day by day passed by, till one morning, bending over a glass that stood beneath the flower she was painting, Fairy Violet saw her own reflection in the clear water. But she saw something more. A pair of wings of the most delicate gossamer, tipped with silver and sparkling with a marvelous radiance, had sprung from her shoulders and rose almost on a level with her tiny head. Fairy Violet had won her wings at last, and the golden gates of fairyland, where the woods and forests were always green and the valleys ever radiant with beautiful flowers, were open to her once more. Wild with joy, she darted out of the window and was already far above the tops of the smoky chimneys when she remembered the patient, suffering girl whose life was slowly wasting away in the close, confined atmosphere of her miserable home. Then her wings drooped and her bright face clouded over. "I must not leave my work unfinished," she said, and with a wistful glance at the white fleecy clouds that seemed to beckon lovingly to her, she returned to the cottage, and the dying girl's last days were brightened by the fairy presence of which she was so unconscious. She knew not that it was from Violet the murmuring music came that delighted her wondering ears, that it was to her she owed the sweet fragrance that filled the air, and the soft fresh coloring of the flower at which she loved to gaze. But though the gentle fairy got no thanks, she felt well rewarded for her labor of love when she saw the peaceful smile that rested on Faith's wasted face, and the light that beamed in her dark eyes. At last the end came. One evening, as the sun was sinking to rest in great waves of crimson and gold, Faith asked for her flower to be brought to her, smiled faintly as her dim eyes rested on it for the last time, laid her head on her mother's breast, and died. A low wailing cry broke from the mother as she felt that never again would the dark eyes be raised lovingly to hers, or the wan face brighten at her approach. But Violet saw what the mother failed to see, that white-robed angels had gathered round the deathbed and were now bearing away the freed spirit with strains of triumphant joy. So she framed the glorious vision into a song, which she sang in the woman's ear, and the mother was comforted, though she knew not why. "'Tis better so, my poor lamb," she muttered, while tears dropped slowly one by one down her sunken cheeks. "There is no pain where thou art gone, no hunger either, and I will join thee there by and by." Then Violet knew that her work was done, and she flew out of the open window and up into the clear sky far above the tops of the tall chimneys. And some men, who were looking up from the dusty streets at sunset, wondering whether the next day would be fine or wet, caught a sudden gleam of her silver-tipped wings and thought it was a flash of summer lightning, and were conscious at the same moment of a delicious fragrance as of violets, and said the wind must be from the west, for it was wafting to them country scents. Fairy Violet laughed as she heard their blundering guesses, a laugh that rippled out on the still air like the chiming of silver bells, and then flew joyously on to thank the Wizard of the Black Rock for his wise counsel. But when she reached the Black Rock, she found the magician, wearied out with a succession of sleepless nights spent in abstruse study and deep research, had fallen fast asleep with his venerable head resting on the mysterious book, and the black dwarf at his feet jealously guarding his slumber. So she trimmed his silver lamp for him afresh, so that it burned with a yet more wonderful brilliance, laid a cluster of sweet flowers beside him, and then gladly flitting from the gloomy rock, spread her glistening wings and darted up into the air, up, far above the tops of the lofty trees, flashing like a bright vision through the now darkening night. She passed the silver moon, which was shining calmly down upon the world she had just left. She threaded her way in and out among the golden stars. On she went till she saw the beautiful radiant light that never dims, and heard the soft murmuring of sweet music, and smelled the delicious fragrance of fairyland. As she passed through the golden gates, she heard a great shout of, "'Tis the Fairy Violet!" And instantly all the bells of fairyland began to ring, and a gay procession of radiant fairies, all dressed in their fairest robes, came to meet her, and pressed round her with a loving welcome and congratulation. "Come to our queen, for she is waiting for you," they cried, and led her in triumph up the shining steps of the fairy palace and into the hall of pearl, where the queen was seated on her throne, dispensing the graceful wreaths, which, woven by her own hand, were the choicest rewards bestowed in fairyland. It was easy to adjudge the crowns of merit among the fairies, for their beauty increased or waned according as they had done well or ill. Now, everyone looking on the Fairy Violet saw that she was the most beautiful of all, for her face was so radiantly lovely that none but the purest fairies could look on it undazzled. So when the queen, after greeting Violet with her sweetest smiles, had asked, "To whom shall I give the fairest crown?" they all shouted unanimously, "To our sister Violet." But Violet lifted her gentle face with a pleading gesture. "May it please your majesty," she said earnestly, "I do not deserve to be so highly honored. My sisters have all done as well as I have." "No, little Violet," said the queen, smiling. "You have done best of all. We all know what your work has been. Listen." Then Violet listened, and she heard a wondrous song, which, rising and falling from each change of the fitful breeze, now broke into a wild strain of piercing sweetness, and anon died away into a soft musical murmur like the rippling of fairy streams. "That song, little Violet," said the queen, "is the record of your life on earth. Listen again." They all listened while the marvelous strain sang of Violet's gentle life on earth. Not a loving word she had ever said, not a kind deed she had ever done, Not a smile her loving arts had brought to the lips of the dying girl, not a blessing uttered by the mother unconscious, to whom she owed the peace and quiet of her daughter's last days. Not a fragrant breath from rescued flower, not a song from grateful bird, but added its sweet note to that marvelous song. Had there been one kind done word, one selfish thought, one cruel deed, the song would have been broken by jarring discords, but all was harmony. Not one harsh note disturbed the rippling melody. As one-on-one Violet's beautiful secrets were brought to light, the fairies looked on her with loving admiration. But Violet was quite ashamed at being praised so openly, and hid her blushing face on Anemone's shoulder. When the story of Violet's deeds was ended, and the wild, mysterious music had lulled into inarticulate murmuring, the fairy queen looked round upon her subjects and asked once more, "To whom shall I give the fairest crown?" And all the fairies cried again, more eagerly than ever, "To Violet! To Violet!" Then Violet could refuse no longer, but bent gracefully on one knee before the throne, while the queen placed the crown on her shining hair. The wonderful music died away into silence, and was never heard again, but the court minstrel, who had listened eagerly to its wild strains, caught the beautiful melody, and repeated it on his harp. And to this day, at fairy feast and revel, the favorite legend is that which tells how the fairy Violet lost and won her wings. End of How the Fairy Violet Lost and Won Her Wings by Marianne L.B. Kerr.
The Finest Liar in the World, edited by Andrew Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the edge of the wood there lived an old man who had only one son. And one day he called the boy to him and said he wanted some corn ground, but the youth must be sure never to enter any mill where the miller was beardless. The boy took the corn and set out, and before he had gone very far he saw a large mill in front of him, with a beardless man standing in the doorway. "Good greeting, beardless one," cried he. "Good greeting, sonny," replied the man. "Could I grind something here?" "Yes, certainly. I will finish what I am doing, and then you can grind as long as you like." But suddenly the boy remembered what his father had told him, and bade farewell to the man, and went further down the river till he came to another mill, not knowing that as soon as his back was turned, the beardless man had picked up a bag of corn and run hastily to the same mill before him. When the boy reached the second mill and saw a second beardless man sitting there, he did not stop and walked on till he came to a third mill. But this time also the beardless man had been too clever for him, and had arrived first by another road. When it happened a fourth time, the boy grew cross, and said to himself, "It is no good going on. There seems to be a beardless man in every mill." And he took his sack from his back, and made up his mind to grind his corn where he was. The beardless man finished grinding his own corn, and when he had done, he said to the boy, who was beginning to grind his, "Suppose, sonny, we make a cake of what you have there." Now the boy had been rather uneasy when he recollected his father's words, but he thought to himself, "What is done cannot be undone," and answered, "Very well, so let it be." Then the beardless one got up, threw the flour into the tub, and made a hole in the middle, telling the boy to fetch some water from the river in his 2 hands to mix the cake. When the cake was ready for baking, they put it on the fire and covered it with hot ashes till it was cooked through. Then they leaned it up against the wall, for it was too big to go into a cupboard, and the beardless one said to the boy, "Look here, sonny, if we share this cake we shall neither of us have enough. Let us see who can tell the biggest lie, and the one who lies the best shall have the whole cake." The boy, not knowing what else to do, answered, "All right, you begin." So the beardless one began to lie with all his might, and when he was tired of inventing new lies, the boy said to him, "My good fellow, if that is all you can do, it is not much. Listen to me, and I will tell you a true story. In my youth, when I was an old man, we had a quantity of beehives. Every morning when I got up, I counted them over, and it was quite easy to number the bees, but I never could reckon the hives properly. One day, as I was counting the bees, I discovered that my best bee was missing, and without losing a moment I saddled a cock and went out to look for him. I traced him as far as the shore, and knew that he had crossed the sea, and that I must follow. When I had reached the other side, I found a man had harnessed my bee to a plow, and with his help was sowing millet seed. "That is my bee," I shouted. "Where did you get him from?" "Brother," replied the man, "if he is yours, take him." And he not only gave me back my bee, but a sack of millet seed into the bargain, because he had made use of my bee. Then I put the bag on my shoulders, took the saddle from the cock, and placed it on the back of the bee, which I mounted, leading the cock by a string so that he should have a rest. As we were flying home over the sea, one of the strings that held the bag of millet broke in two, and the sack dropped straight into the ocean. It was quite lost, of course, and there was no use thinking about it, and by the time we were safe back again, night had come. I then got down from my bee and let him loose that he might get his supper, gave the cock some hay, and went to sleep myself. But when I awoke with the sun, what a scene met my eyes! During the night, wolves had come and eaten my bee, and honey lay ankle-deep in the valley and knee-deep on the hills. Then I began to consider how I could best collect some to take home with me. Now it happened that I had with me a small hatchet, and this I took to the wood, hoping to meet some animal which I could kill, whose skin I might turn into a bag. As I entered the forest, I saw 2 roe deer hopping on 1 foot, so I slew them with a single blow, and made 3 bags from their skins, all of which I filled with honey and placed on the back of the cock. At length I reached home, where I was told that my father had just been born, and that I must go at once to fetch some holy water to sprinkle him with. As I went, I turned over in my mind if there was no way for me to get back my millet seed, which had dropped into the sea, and when I had arrived at the place with the holy water, I saw the seed had fallen on fruitful soil, and was growing before my eyes. And more than that, it was even cut by an invisible hand and made into a cake. So I took the cake as well as the holy water, and was flying back with them over the sea, where there fell a great rain, and the sea was swollen and swept away my millet cake. Ah, how vexed I was at its loss when I was safe on earth again! Suddenly I remembered that my hair was very long. If I stood, it touched the ground, although if I was sitting, it only reached my ears. I seized a knife and cut off a large lock, which I plaited together, and when night came, tied it into a knot, and prepared to use it for a pillow. But what was I to do for a fire? A tinder box I had, but no wood. Then it occurred to me that I had stuck a needle in my clothes, so I took the needle and split it in pieces, and lit it, then laid myself down by the fire and went to sleep. But ill luck still pursued me. While I was sleeping, a spark from the fire lighted on the hair, which was burnt up in a moment. In despair, I threw myself on the ground, and instantly sank in it as far as my waist. I struggled to get out, but only fell in further, so I ran to the house, seized a spade, dug myself out, and took home the holy water. On the way, I noticed that the ripe fields were full of reapers, and suddenly the air became so frightfully hot that the men dropped down in a faint. Then I called to them, "Why don't you bring out our mare, which is as tall as 2 days and as broad as half a day, and make a shade for yourselves?" My father heard what I said and jumped quickly on the mare, and the reapers worked with a will in the shadow, while I snatched up a wooden pail to bring them some water to drink. When I got to the well, everything was frozen hard, so in order to draw some water, I had to take off my head and break the ice with it. As I drew near them, carrying the water, the reapers all cried out, "Why, what has become of your head?" I put up my hand and discovered that I really had no head, and that I must have left it in the well. I ran back to look for it, but found that meanwhile a fox which was passing by had pulled my head out of the water and was tearing at my brains. I stole cautiously up to him, and gave him such a kick that he uttered a loud scream, and let fall a parchment on which was written, "The cake is mine, and the beardless one goes empty-handed." With these words the boy rose, took the cake, and went home, while the beardless one remained to swallow his disappointment. End of The Finest Liar in the World.
King Thrushbeard by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. A king had a daughter who was beautiful beyond all measure, but so proud and haughty withal that no suitor was good enough for her. She sent away one after the other and made fun of them as well. Once the king gave a great feast and invited thereto, from far and near, all the young men likely to marry. They were marshaled in a row according to their rank and standing. First came the kings, then the grand dukes, then the princes, the earls, the barons, and the gentry. Then the king's daughter was led through the ranks, but to every one she had some objection to make. One was too fat, the wine cask, she said. Another was too tall, long and thin, has little in. The third was too short, short and thick is never quick. The fourth was too pale as death. The fifth too red, a fighting cock. The sixth was not straight enough. A green log dried behind the stove. So she had something to say against every one. But she made herself especially merry over a good king who stood quite high up in the row and whose chin had grown a little crooked. "Well," she cried and laughed, "he has a chin like a thrushbeak." And from that time he got the name of King Thrushbeard. But the old king, when he saw that his daughter did nothing but mock people and despise all the suitors who were gathered there, was very angry, and swore that she should have for her husband the very first beggar that came to his doors. A few days afterward, a fiddler came and sang beneath the windows, trying to earn a small alms. When the king heard him, he said, "Let him come up." So the fiddler came up in his dirty, ragged clothes and sang before the king and his daughter. When he had ended, he asked for a trifling gift. The king said, "Your song has pleased me so well that I will give you my daughter there to wife." The king's daughter shuddered, but the king said, "I have taken an oath to give you to the very first beggar man, and I will keep it." All she could say was in vain. The priest was brought, and she had let herself be wedded to the fiddler on the spot. When that was done, the king said, "Now it is not proper for you, a beggar woman, to stay any longer in my palace. You may go with your husband." The beggar man led her out by the hand, and she was obliged to go away on foot with him. When they came to the large forest, she asked, "To whom does this beautiful forest belong?" "It belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had taken him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." Afterward they came to a meadow, and she asked again, "To whom does this beautiful green meadow belong?" "It belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had taken him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." Then they came to a large town, and she asked again, "To whom does this fine large town belong?" "It belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had taken him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." "It does not please me," said the fiddler, "to hear you always wishing for another husband. Am I not good enough for you?" At last they came to a very little hut, and she said, "Oh, goodness, what a small house! To whom does this miserable, mean hovel belong?" The fiddler answered, "That is my house and yours, where we shall live together." She had to stoop in order to go into the low door. "Where are the servants?" said the king's daughter. "What servants?" answered the beggar man. "You must do what you wish to have done. Just make a fire at once and set on water to cook my supper. I am quite tired." But the king's daughter knew nothing about lighting fires or cooking, and the beggar man had to lend a hand himself to get anything fairly done. When they had finished their scanty meal, they went to bed, but he forced her to get up quite early in the morning in order to look after the house. For a few days they lived in this way as well as might be, and ate up all the food in the house. Then the man said, "Wife, we cannot go on any longer eating and drinking here and earning nothing. You must weave baskets." He went out, cut some willows, and brought them home. Then she began to weave, but the tough willows wounded her delicate hands. "I see that this will not do," said the man. "You had better spin. Perhaps you can do that." She sat down and tried to spin, but the hard thread soon cut her soft fingers so that the blood ran down. "See," said the man, "you are fit for no sort of work. I have made a bad bargain with you. Now I will try to earn a living by selling pots and earthenware. You must sit in the marketplace and sell the ware." "Alas," thought she, "if any of the people from my father's kingdom come to the market and see me sitting there, selling, how they will mock me." But it was of no use. She had to yield unless she chose to die of hunger. For the first time she succeeded well, for the people were glad to buy women's wares because she was good-looking, and they paid her what she asked. Many even gave her the money and left the pots with her as well. So they lived on what she had earned as long as it lasted. Then the husband bought a lot of new crockery. With this she sat down at the corner of the marketplace and set it around her ready for sale. But suddenly there came a drunken soldier galloping along, and he rode right amongst the pots so that they were all broken in 1,000 bits. She began to weep. She did not know what to do for fear. "Alas, what will happen to me?" she cried. "What will my husband say to this?" She ran home and told him of the misfortune. "Who would seat herself at a corner of the marketplace with crockery?" said the man. "Leave off crying. I see very well that you cannot do ordinary work. So I have been to our king's palace and have asked whether they cannot find a place for a kitchen maid. They have promised me to take you. In that way you will get your food for nothing." The king's daughter was now a kitchen maid and had to be at the cook's beck and call and do the dirtiest work. In each of her pockets she fastened a little jar in which she took home her share of the leavings, and upon this they lived. It happened that the wedding of the king's eldest son was to be celebrated, so the poor woman went up and placed herself by the door of the hall to look on. When all the candles were lit, and people, each more beautiful than the other, entered, and all was full of pomp and splendor, she thought of her lot with a sad heart, and cursed the pride and haughtiness which had humbled her and brought her to her great poverty. The smell of the delicious dishes which were being taken in and out reached her, and now and then the servants threw her a few morsels. These she put in her jars to take home. All at once the king's son entered, clothed in velvet and silk, with gold chains around his neck. And when he saw the beautiful woman standing by the door, he seized her by the hand and would have danced with her, but she refused and shrank back with fear, for she saw that it was King Thrushbeard, the suitor whom she had driven away with scorn. Her struggles were of no use. He drew her into the hall, but the string by which her pockets were fastened broke. The pots fell down, the soup ran out, and the scraps were scattered all around. When the people saw it, there arose laughter and derision, and she was so ashamed that she would rather have been 1,000 fathoms below ground. She sprang to the door and would have run away, but on the stairs a man caught her and brought her back, and when she looked at him, it was King Thrushbeard. He said to her kindly, "Do not be afraid. I and the fiddler who have been living with you in that wretched hovel are one. For love of you, I disguised myself so, and I also was the soldier who rode through your crockery. This was all done to humble your proud spirit and to punish you for the insolence with which you mocked me." Then she wept bitterly and said, "I have done great wrong. I am not worthy to be your wife." But he said, "Be comforted. The evil days are past. Now we will celebrate our wedding." Then the maids in waiting came and put the most splendid clothing on her. Her father and his whole court arrived and wished her happiness in her marriage to King Thrushbeard, and the joy now began in earnest. I wish you and I had been there too. End of King Thrushbeard by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, read by Suzabelle.
The Legend of the Christmas Tree by Lucy Wheelock. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Two little children were sitting by the fire one cold winter's night. All at once they heard a timid knock at the door, and one ran to open it. There, outside in the cold and the darkness, stood a child with no shoes upon his feet and clad in thin, ragged garments. He was shivering with cold, and he asked to come in and warm himself. "Yes, come in," cried both children. "You shall have our place by the fire. Come in." They drew the little stranger to their warm seat and shared their supper with him and gave him their bed, while they slept on a hard bench. In the night they were awakened by strains of sweet music, and, looking out, they saw a band of children in shining garments approaching the house. They were playing on golden harps, and the air was full of melody. Suddenly the stranger child stood before them, no longer cold and ragged, but clad in silvery light. His soft voice said, "I was cold, and you took me in. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was tired, and you gave me your bed. I am the Christ child, wandering through the world to bring peace and happiness to all good children. As you have given to me, so may this tree every year give rich fruit to you." So saying, he broke a branch from the fir tree that grew near the door, and he planted it in the ground and disappeared. But the branch grew into a great tree, and every year it bore wonderful golden fruit for the kind children. End of The Legend of the Christmas Tree by Lucy Wheelock. Read by Kirsten, Sande. The Little Match Girl by Hans Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Little Match Girl. It was dreadfully cold, it was snowing fast, and it was almost dark as evening came on. The last evening of the year. In the cold and the darkness there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded and with naked feet. When she left home she had slippers on, it is true, but they were much too large for her feet. Slippers that her mother had used until then, and the poor little girl lost them in running across the street when two carriages were passing terribly fast. When she looked for them, one of them was not to be found, and a boy seized the other and ran away with it, saying he would use it for a cradle some day when he had children of his own. So on the little girl went with her bare feet, that were red and blue with cold. In an old apron that she wore were bundles of matches, and she carried a bundle also in her hand. No one had bought so much as a bunch all the long day, and no one had given her even a penny. Poor little girl, shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along, a perfect picture of misery. Snowflakes fell on her long flaxen hair, which hung in pretty curls about her throat. She thought not of her beauty nor of the cold. Lights gleamed in every window, and there came to her the savory smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve, and it was of this which she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, one of which projected beyond the other, she sat cowering down. She had drawn under her little feet, but still she grew colder and colder, yet she dared not go home, for she had sold no matches and could not bring a penny of money. Her father would certainly beat her, and besides it was cold enough at home, for they had only the house roof above them, and the largest holes had been stopped with straw and rags. There were left many through which the cold wind whistled. And now her little hands were nearly frozen with cold. Alas, a single match might do her good, if she might only draw it from the bundle, rub it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. So at last she drew one out. How it blazed and burned! It gave out a warm, bright flame like a little candle. As she held her hands over it, a wonderful little light it was. It really seemed to the little girl as if she sat before a great iron stove with polished brass feet and a brass shovel and tongs. So blessedly it burned that the little maiden stretched out her feet to warm them also. How comfortable she was! But lo, the flame went out, the stove vanished, and nothing remained but the little burned match in her hand. She rubbed another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell upon the wall it became transparent like a veil, so she could see through it into the room. A snow-white cloth was spread upon the table, on which was a beautiful china dinner service, while a roast goose stuffed with apples and prunes steamed famously and sent forth the most savory smell. And what was more delightful still, and wonderful, the goose jumped from the dish, with knife and fork still in its breast, and waddled along the floor straight to the little girl. But the match went out then, and nothing was left to her but the thick, damp wall. She lighted another match, and now she was under a most beautiful Christmas tree, larger and far more prettily trimmed than the one she had seen through the glass door at the rich merchant's. Hundreds of wax tapers were burning on the green branches, and gay figures such as she had seen in the shop windows looked down upon her. The child stretched out her hands to them, and then the match went out. Still the lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them as stars in heaven, and one of them fell, forming a long trail of fire. "Now someone is dying," murmured the child softly, for her grandmother, the only person who had loved her, and who was now dead, had told her that whenever a star falls, a soul mounts up to God. She struck yet another match against the wall, and again it was light, and in the brightness there appeared before her the dear old grandmother, bright and radiant, yet sweet and mild, and happy as she had never looked on earth. "Oh, grandmother," cried the child, "take me with you. I know you will go away when the match burns out. You too will vanish, like the warm stove, the splendid New Year's feast, and the beautiful Christmas tree. and lest her grandmother should disappear, she rubbed the whole bundle of matches against the wall. And the matches burned with such a brilliant light that it became brighter than noonday. Her grandmother had never looked so grand and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and both flew together, joyously and gloriously, mounting higher and higher, far above the earth. And for them there was neither hunger nor cold nor care. They were with God. But in the corner, at the dawn of the day, sat the poor girl, leaning against the wall with red cheeks and smiling mouth, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and cold she sat, with the matches, one bundle of which was burned. She wanted to warm herself, poor little thing, people said. No one imagined what sweet visions she had had, or how gloriously she had gone with her grandmother to enter upon the joys of a new year. End of The Little Match Girl by Hans Andersen. Read by Kirsten Sande.
Little Red Cap by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time, there was a dear little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother, and there was nothing that she would not have given to the child. Once, she gave her a little cap of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else, so she was always called Little Red Cap. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Cap, here is a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good. Set out before it gets hot, and when you are going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path, or you may fall and break the bottle, and then your grandmother will get nothing. And when you go into her room, don't forget to say, 'Good morning,' and don't peep into every corner before you do it." "I will take great care," said Little Red Cap to her mother, and gave her hand on it. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village, and just as Little Red Cap entered the wood, a wolf met her. Red Cap did not know what a wicked creature he was, and was not at all afraid of him. "Good day, Little Red Cap," said he. "Thank you kindly, wolf." "Whither away so early, Little Red Cap?" "To my grandmother's." "What have you got in your apron?" "Cake and wine. Yesterday was baking day, so poor sick grandmother is to have something good, to make her stronger." "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Cap?" "A good quarter of a league farther on in the wood. Her house stands under the 3 large oak trees. The nut trees are just below." "You surely must know it," replied Little Red Cap. The wolf thought to himself, "What a tender young creature! What a nice, plump mouthful! She will be better to eat than the old woman. I must act craftily so as to catch both." So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Cap, and then he said, "See, Little Red Cap, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why do you not look round? I believe, too, that you do not hear how sweetly the little birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else out here in the wood is merry." Little Red Cap raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there through the trees, and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, "Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay. That would please her too. It is so early in the day that I shall still get there in time." And so she ran from the path into the wood to look for flowers, and whenever she had picked one, she fancied that she saw a still prettier one farther on, and ran after it, and so got deeper and deeper into the wood. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. "Who's there?" "Little Red Cap," replied the wolf. "She is bringing cake and wine. Open the door." "Lift the latch," called out the grandmother. "I am too weak and cannot get up." The wolf lifted the latch, the door sprang open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Cap, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she had gathered so many that she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother, and set out on the way to her. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she went into the room, she had such a strange feeling that she said to herself, "Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today, and at other times I like being with grandmother so much." She called out, "Good morning," but received no answer, so she went to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay her grandmother with her cap pulled far over her face and looking very strange. "Oh, grandmother," she said, "what big ears you have!" "The better to hear you with, my child," was the reply. "But, grandmother, what big eyes you have," she said. "The better to see you with, my dear." "But, grandmother, what large hands you have." "The better to hug you with." "Oh, but, grandmother, what a terrible big mouth you have." "The better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this than with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Redcap. When the wolf had appeased his appetite, he lay down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loud. The huntsman was just passing the house and thought to himself, "How the old woman is snoring! I must just see if she wants anything." So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it. "Do I find you here, you old sinner?" said he. "I have long sought you." Then, just as he was going to fire at him, it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother, and that she might still be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. When he had made 2 snips, he saw the little red cap shining, and then he made 2 snips more, and the little girl sprang out, crying, "Ah, how frightened I've been! How dark it was inside the wolf!" And after that the aged grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe. Redcap, however, quickly fetched great stones with which they filled the wolf's belly, and when he awoke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy that he collapsed at once and fell dead. Then all 3 were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Redcap had brought and revived, but Redcap thought to herself, "As long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the wood, when my mother has forbidden me to do so." It also related that once when Redcap was again taking cakes to the old grandmother, another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her from the path. Redcap, however, was on her guard and went straight forward on her way, and told her grandmother that she had met the wolf, and that he had said good morning to her, but with such a wicked look in his eyes, that if they had not been on the public road, she was certain he would have eaten her up. "Well," said grandmother, "we will shut the door, that he may not come in." Soon afterwards the wolf knocked and cried, "Open the door, grandmother. I am little Redcap, and am bringing you some cakes." But they did not speak or open the door, so the grey-beard stole twice or thrice around the house, and at last jumped on the roof, intending to wait until Redcap went home in the evening, and then to steal after her and devour her in the darkness. But the grandmother saw what was in his thoughts. In front of the house was a great stone trough, so she said to the child, "Take the pail, Redcap. I made some sausages yesterday, so carry the water in which I boiled them to the trough." Redcap carried until the great trough was quite full. Then the smell of the sausages reached the wolf, and he sniffed and peeped down, and at last stretched out his neck so far that he could no longer keep his footing and began to slip, and slipped down from the roof straight into the great trough, and was drowned. But Redcap went joyously home, and no one ever did anything to harm her again. End of Little Red Cap by the Brothers Grimm. Rapunzel by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There were once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. At length, the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. These people had a little window at the back of their house from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it because it belonged to an enchantress who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day, the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden, when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful rampion, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it. She quite pined away, and began to look pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed, and asked, "What ails you, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't eat some of the rampion which is in the garden behind our house, I shall die." The man, who loved her, thought, Sooner than let your wife die, bring her some of the rampion yourself, let it cost what it will." At twilight he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of rampion, and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it and ate it greedily. It tasted so good to her, so very good, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of evening, therefore, he let himself down again. But when he had clambered down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How can you dare," said she with angry look, "descend into my garden and steal my rampion like a thief? You shall suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your rampion from the window and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him, "If the case be as you say, I will allow you to take away with you as much rampion as you will. Only I make one condition. You must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man in his terror consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower which lay in a forest, and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her, and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I too will try my fortune," said he, and the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Immediately the hair fell down, and the king's son climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel does." And she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said, "I will willingly go away with you, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with you a skein of silk every time that you come, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready, I will descend, and you will take me on your horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, you wicked child!" cried the enchantress. "What do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me." In her anger, she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day that she cast out Rapunzel, however, the enchantress fastened the braids of hair, which she had cut off, to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me," she let the hair down. The king's son ascended, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel, he found the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks. "Aha!" she cried mockingly. "You would fetch your dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you. You will never see her again." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did naught but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel with the twins, to which he had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. End of Rapunzel by the Brothers Grimm.
Rumplestiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. By the side of a wood, in a country a long way off, ran a fine stream of water. And upon the stream there stood a mill. The miller's house was close by, and the miller, you must know, had a very beautiful daughter. She was moreover very shrewd and clever, and the miller was so proud of her that one day he told the king of the land, who used to come and hunt in the wood, that his daughter could spin gold out of straw. Now this king was very fond of money, and when he heard the miller's boast his greediness was raised, and he sent for the girl to be brought before him. Then he led her to a chamber in his palace, where there was a great heap of straw, and gave her a spinning wheel, and said, "All this must be spun into gold before morning, as you love your life." It was in vain that the poor maiden said that it was only a silly boast of her father, for that she could do no such thing as spin straw into gold. The chamber door was locked, and she was left alone. She sat down in one corner of the room and began to bewail her hard fate, when on a sudden the door opened, and a droll-looking little man hobbled in and said, "Good morrow to you, my good lass. What are you weeping for?" "Alas," she said, "I must spin this straw into gold, and I know not how." "What will you give me," said the hobgoblin, "to do it for you?" "My necklace," replied the maiden. He took her at her word, and sat himself down to the wheel, and whistled, and sang, round about, lo and behold, reel away, straw into gold." And round about the wheel went merrily. The work was quickly done, and the straw was all spun into gold. When the king came and saw this, he was greatly astonished and pleased, but his heart grew still more greedy of gain, and he shut up the poor miller's daughter again with a fresh task. Then she knew not what to do, sat down once more to weep, but the dwarf soon opened the door and said, "What will you give me to do your task?" "The ring on my finger," she said. So her little friend took the ring and began to work at the wheel again, and whistled and sang, round about, lo and behold, reel away, straw into gold, till long before morning all was done again. The king was greatly delighted to see all this glittering treasure, but still he had not enough, so he took the miller's daughter to yet a larger heap and said, "All this must be spun tonight, and if it is, you shall be my queen." As soon as she was alone, that dwarf, he came in and said, "What will you give me to spin gold for you this third time?" "I have nothing left," she said. "Then say you will give me," said the little man, "the first little child that you may have when you are queen." "That may never be," thought the miller's daughter, and as she knew no other way to get the task done, she said she would do what he asked. Round went the wheel again to the old song. The mannikin once more spun the heap into gold. The king came in the morning, and finding all that he wanted, was forced to keep his word. So he married the miller's daughter, and she really became queen. At the birth of her first little child, she was so very glad and forgot the dwarf and what she had said. But one day he came into her room where she was sitting, playing with her baby, and put her in mind of it. Then she grieved sorely at her misfortune, and said she would give him all the wealth of the kingdom if he would let her off, but in vain. Till at last her tears softened to him, and he said, "I will give you 3 days' grace, and if during that time you tell me my name, you shall keep your child." Now the queen lay awake all night thinking of all the odd names that she had ever heard, and she sent messengers all over the land to find out new ones. The next day the little man came, and she began with Timothy, Ichabod, Benjamin, Jeremiah, and all the names she could remember. But to all and each of them he said, "Madam, that is not my name." The second day she began with all the comical names she could hear of Bandy-Legs, Hunchback, Crookshanks, and so on. But the little gentleman still said to every one of them, "Madam, that is not my name." The third day one of the messengers came back and said, "I have traveled 2 days without hearing of any other names, but yesterday, as I was climbing a high hill among the trees of the forest where the fox and the hare bid each other good night, I saw a little hut, and before the hut burned a fire. Round about that fire a funny little dwarf was dancing upon one leg and singing, 'Merrily the feast I'll make, today I'll brew, tomorrow bake, merrily I'll dance and sing, for next day will a stranger bring. Little does my lady dream, Rumplestiltskin is my name.'" When the queen heard this, she jumped for joy, and as soon as her little friend came, she sat down upon her throne, called all her court round to enjoy the fun. And the nurse stood by her side with the baby in her arms, as if it was quite ready to be given up. Then the little man began to chuckle at the thought of having the poor child to take home with him to his hut in the woods, and he cried out, "Now, lady, what is my name?" "Is it John?" asked she. "No, madam." "Is it Tom?" "No, madam." "Is it Jemmy?" "It is not." "Can your name be Rumpelstiltskin?" said the lady slyly. "Some witch told you that! Some witch told you that!" cried the little man, and dashed his right foot in a rage so deep into the floor that he was forced to lay hold of it with both hands to pull it out. Then he made the best of his way off, while the nurse laughed and the baby crowed, and all the court jeered at him for having had so much trouble for nothing, and said, "We wish you a very good morning and a merry feast, Mr. Rumpelstiltskin." The End. Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. Read by KristyM.
Sweet Porridge, Grimm's Fairy Tales. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was a poor, good little girl who lived alone with her mother, and they had nothing more to eat. So the child went into the forest, and an old woman met her, who knew of her sorrow, and gave her a little pot, which, when she said, "Boil, little pot, boil," would cook good, sweet porridge. And when she said, "Stop, little pot, stop," it ceased to cook. The little girl took the pot home to her mother, and now they were freed from their poverty and hunger, and ate sweet porridge as often as they liked. Once on a time, when the little girl had gone out, the mother said, "Boil, little pot, boil," and it began to cook, and she ate till she was satisfied. Then she wanted the pot to stop cooking, but did not know the word. So it went on cooking, and the porridge rose over the edge, and still it cooked on till the kitchen and the whole house was full, and then the next house, and then the whole street, just as if it wanted to satisfy the hunger of the whole world. And there was the greatest trouble, and no one knew how to stop it. At last, when only a single house was left, the child came home and just said, "Stop, little pot, stop," and it stopped cooking. And whosoever wished to return to the town had to eat his way back. End of Sweet Porridge, Grimm's Fairy Tales, read by Suzabelle.
The Capture of Father Time by L. Frank Baum. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Jim was the son of a cowboy and lived on the broad plains of Arizona. His father had trained him to lasso a bronco or a young bull with perfect accuracy. And had Jim possessed the strength to back up his skill, he would have been as good a cowboy as any in Arizona. When he was 12 years old, he made his first visit to the East, where Uncle Charles, his father's brother, lived. Of course, Jim took his lasso with him, for he was proud of his skill in casting it and wanted to show his cousins what a cowboy could do. At first, the city boys and girls were much interested in watching Jim lasso posts and fence pickets, but they soon tired of it, and even Jim decided it was not the right sort of sport for the cities. But one day the butcher asked Jim to ride one of his horses into the country to a pasture that had been engaged, and Jim eagerly consented. He had been longing for a horseback ride, and to make it seem like old times, he took his lasso with him. He rode through the streets demurely enough, but upon reaching the open country roads, his spirit broke forth into wild jubilation, and, urging the butcher's horse to full gallop, he dashed away in true cowboy fashion. Then he wanted still more liberty, and letting down the bars that led into a big field, he began riding over the meadow and throwing his lasso at imaginary cattle, while he yelled and whooped to his heart's content. Suddenly, on making a long cast with his lasso, the loop caught upon something and rested about 3 feet from the ground, while the rope drew taut and nearly pulled Jim from his horse. This was unexpected. More than that, it was wonderful, for the field seemed bare of even a stump. Jim's eyes grew big with amazement, but he knew he had caught something when a voice cried out, "Here, let go, let go! I say, can't you see what you've done?" No, Jim couldn't see, nor did he intend to let go until he found out what was holding the loop of the lasso. So he resorted to an old trick his father had taught him, and, putting the butcher's horse to a run, began riding a circle around the spot where his lasso had caught. As he thus drew nearer and nearer his quarry, he saw the rope coil up, yet it looked to be coiling over nothing but air. One end of the lasso had made fast to a ring in the saddle, and when the rope almost wound up and the horse began to pull away and snort with fear, Jim dismounted. Holding the reins of the bridle in one hand, he followed the rope, and an instant later saw an old man caught fast in the coils of the lasso. His head was bald and uncovered, but long white whiskers drew down to his waist. About his body was thrown a loose robe of fine white linen. In one hand he bore a great sickle, and beneath the other arm he carried an hourglass. While Jim gazed wonderingly upon him, this vulnerable old man spoke in an angry voice. "Now then, get that rope off as fast as you can. You've brought everything on the earth to a standstill by your foolishness." "Well, what are you staring at? Don't you know who I am?" No, said Jim stupidly. Well, I'm Father Time. Now make haste and set me free if you want the world to run properly. How did I happen to catch you? Asked Jim, without making a move to release his captive. I don't know. I've never been caught before, growled Father Time. But I suppose it was because you were foolishly throwing your lasso at nothing. I didn't see you, said Jim. Of course you didn't. I'm invisible to the eyes of human beings, unless they get within 3 feet of me, and I take care to keep more than that distance away from them. That's why I was crossing this field, where I supposed no one would be, and I should have been perfectly safe had it not been for your beastly lasso. Now then, he added crossly, are you going to let that rope off? Why should I? Asked Jim. Because everything in the world stopped moving the moment you caught me. I don't suppose you want to make an end of all business and pleasure, and war and love, and misery and ambition, and everything else, do you? Not a watch has ticked since you tied me up here like a mummy. Jim laughed. It was really funny to see the old man wound round and round with coils of rope from his knees up to his chin. It'll do you good to rest, said the boy. From all I've heard, you lead a rather busy life. Indeed I do, replied Father Time with a sigh. I'm due in Kamchatka this very minute, and to think one small boy is upsetting all my regular habits. Too bad, said Jim with a grin. But since the world has stopped anyhow, it won't matter if it takes a little longer to recess. As soon as I let you go, time will fly again. Where are your wings? I haven't any, answered the old man. That is a story cooked up by someone who never saw me. As a matter of fact, I move rather slowly. I see. You take your time, remarked the boy. What do you use that sickle for? To mow down the people, said the ancient one. Every time I swing my sickle, someone dies. Then I ought to win a life-saving medal by keeping you tied up, said Jim. Some folks will live this much longer. But they won't know it, said Father Time, with a sad smile. So it will do them no good. You may as well untie me at once. No, said Jim, with a determined air. I may never capture you again, so I'll hold you for a while and see how the world wags without you. Then he swung the old man, bound as he was, upon the back of the butcher's horse, and, getting into the saddle himself, started back towards town, one hand holding his prisoner and the other guiding his rails. When he reached the road, his eyes fell on a strange tableau. A horse and buggy stood in the middle of the road, the horse in the act of trotting, with his head held high and 2 legs in the air, but perfectly motionless. In the buggy, a man and a woman were seated, but they had been turned into stone. They could not have been more still and stiff. There's no time for them, sighed the old man. Won't you let me go now? Not yet, replied the boy. He rode on until he reached the city, where all the people stood in exactly the same positions they were in when Jim lassoed Father Time. Stopping in the front of a big dry goods store, the boy hitched his horse and went in. The clerks were measuring out goods and showing patterns to the rows of customers in front of them. But everyone seemed suddenly to have become a statue. There was something very unpleasant in this scene, and a cold shiver began to run up and down Jim's back, so he hurried out again. On the edge of the sidewalk sat a poor crippled beggar, holding out his hat, and beside him stood a prosperous-looking gentleman who was about to drop a penny into the beggar's hat. Jim knew this gentleman to be very rich, but rather stingy, so he ventured to run his hand into the man's pocket and take out his purse, in which was a $20 gold piece. This glittering coin he put into the gentleman's finger instead of the penny, and then restored the purse to the rich man's pocket. That donation will surprise him when he comes to life, thought the boy. He mounted the horse again and rode up the street, As he passed the shop of his friend, the butcher, he noticed several pieces of meat hanging outside. "I'm afraid that meat'll spoil," he remarked. "It takes time to spoil meat," answered the old man. This struck Jim as being queer, but true. "It seems time meddles with everything," he said. "Yes, you've made a prisoner of the most important personage in the world," groaned the old man, "and you haven't enough sense to let him go again." Jim did not reply, and soon they came to his uncle's house, where he again dismounted. The street was filled with teams and people, but all were motionless. His two little cousins were just coming out the gate on their way to the school, with their books and slates underneath their arms. So Jim had to jump over the fence to avoid knocking them down. In the front room sat his aunt, reading her Bible. She was just turning a page when time stopped. In the dining room was his uncle, finishing his luncheon. His mouth was open and his fork poised just before it, while his eyes were fixed upon the newspaper folded beside him. Jim helped himself to his uncle's pie, and while he ate it, he walked out to his prisoner. "There's one thing I don't understand," he said. "What's that?" asked Father Time. "Why is it I'm able to move around while everyone else is froze up?" "That is because I'm your prisoner," answered the other. "You can do anything you wish with time now, but unless you are careful, you'll do something you will be sorry for." Jim threw the crust of his pie at a bird that was suspended in the air, where it had been flying when time stopped. "Anyway," he laughed, "I'm living longer than anyone else. No one will ever be able to catch up with me again." "Each life has its allotted span," said the old man. "When you have lived your proper time, my sickle will mow you down." "I forgot your sickle," said Jim thoughtfully. Then a spirit of mischief came into the boy's head, for he happened to think that the present opportunity to have fun would never occur again. He tied Father Time to his uncle's hitching post, that he might not escape, and then crossed the road to the corner grocery. The grocer had scolded Jim that very morning for stepping into a basket of turnips by accident. So the boy went to the back end of the grocery and turned on the faucet of the molasses barrel. "That'll make a nice mess when time starts the molasses running all over the floor," said Jim with a laugh. A little further down the street was a barber's shop, and sitting in the barber's chair, Jim saw the man that all the boys declared was the meanest man in town. He certainly did not like the boys, and the boys knew it. The barber was in the act of shampooing this person when time was captured. Jim ran to the drugstore, and getting a bottle of mucilage, he returned and poured it over the ruffled hair of the unpopular citizen. "That'll probably surprise him when he wakes up," thought Jim. Nearby was the schoolhouse. Jim entered it and found that only a few of the pupils were assembled. But the teacher sat at his desk, stern and frowning as usual. Taking a piece of chalk, Jim marked upon the blackboard in big letters the following words: "Every scholar is requested to yell the minute he enters the room. He will also please throw his books at the teacher's head. Signed, Professor Sharpie." "That ought to raise a nice rumpus," murmured the mischief maker as he walked away. On the corner stood Policeman Mulligan, talking with old Miss Scrapple, the worst gossip in town, who always delighted in saying something disagreeable about her neighbors. Jim thought this opportunity was too good to lose, so he took off the policeman's cap and brass-buttoned coat and put them on Miss Scrapple, while the ladies feathered and ribboned hat he placed jauntily upon the policeman's head. The effect was so comical that the boy laughed aloud. And as a good many people were standing near the corner, Jim decided that Miss Scrapple and Officer Mulligan would create a sensation when time started upon his travels. Then the young cowboy remembered his prisoner, and walking back to the hitching post, he came within 3 feet of it and saw Father Time still standing patiently within the toils of the lasso. He looked angry and annoyed, however, and growled, "Well, when do you intend to release me?" "I've been thinking about that ugly sickle of yours," said Jim. "What about it?" asked Father Time. "Perhaps if I let you go, you'll swing it at me the first thing, to be revenged," replied the boy. Father Time gave him a severe look, but said, "I've known boys for thousands of years, and of course I know they're mischievous and reckless. But I like boys, because they grow up to be men and people, my world. Now, if a man had caught me by accident, as you did, I could have scared him into letting me go instantly. But boys are harder to scare. I don't know as I blame you, but I was a boy myself long ago, when the world was new. But surely you've had enough fun with me by this time, and now I hope you'll show the respect that is due to old age. Let me go, and in return I'll promise to forget about my capture. The incident won't do much harm anyway, for no one will ever know that time has halted the last 3 hours or so." "All right," said Jim cheerfully. "Since you've promised not to mow me down, I'll let you go." But he had a notion some people in town would suspect time had stopped when they returned to life. He carefully unwound the rope from the old man, who, when he was free, at once shouldered his sickle, rearranged his white robe, and nodded farewell. The next moment he had disappeared, and with a rustle and rumble and roar of activity, the world came to life again and jogged along as it always had before. Jim wound up his lasso, mounted the butcher's horse, and rode slowly down the street. Loud screams came from the corner, where a great crowd of people quickly assembled. From his seat on the horse, Jim saw Miss Scrapple, attired in the policeman's uniform, angrily shaking her fists in Mulligan's face, while the officer was furiously stamping upon the lady's hat, which he had torn from his own head amidst the jeers of the crowd. As he rode past the schoolhouse, he heard a tremendous chorus of yells, and knew Professor Sharpie was having a hard time to quell the riot caused by the sign on the blackboard. Through the window of the barber shop, he saw the mean man frantically belaboring the barber with a hairbrush, while his hair stood up stiff as bayonets in all directions. And the grocer ran out of his door and yelled, "Fire!" while his shoes left a track of molasses wherever he stepped. Jim's heart was filled with joy. He was fairly reveling in the excitement he had caused when someone caught his leg and pulled him from the horse. "What are you doing here, you rascal?" cried the butcher angrily. "Didn't you promise to put that beast inter Plimpton's pasture? And now I find you riding that poor nag around like a gentleman o' leisure." "That's a fact," said Jim with surprise. "I clean forgot about the horse." This story should teach us the supreme importance of time and the folly of trying to stop it. For should you succeed, as Jim did, in bringing time to a standstill, the world would soon become a dreary place and life decidedly unpleasant. End of The Capture of Father Time by L. Frank Baum. Read by Max Hollway.
The Star Money by Grimm's Fairy Tales. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. There was once on a time a little girl whose father and mother were dead. She was so poor that she no longer had any little room to live in or bed to sleep in. At last, she had nothing else but the clothes she was wearing and a little bit of bread in her hand, which some charitable soul had given her. She was, however, good and pious. And as she was thus forsaken by all the world, she went forth into the open country, trusting in the good God. Then a poor man met her, who said, "Ah, give me something to eat, I am so hungry." She reached him the whole of her piece of bread and said, "May God bless it to your use," and went onward. Then came a child who moaned and said, "My head is so cold, give me something to cover it with." She took off her hood and gave it to him, and when she had walked a little further, she met another child who had no jacket and was frozen with cold. Then she gave it her own, and a little farther on, one begged for a frock, and she gave away that also. At length she got into a forest, and it had already become dark, and there came yet another child and asked for a little shirt. The good little girl thought to herself, "It's a dark night and no one sees me. I can very well give my little shirt away," and took it off and gave away that also. And she so stood and had not one single thing left. Then suddenly some stars from heaven fell down, and they were nothing else but hard, smooth pieces of money. And although she had just given her little shirt away, lo, she had a new one, which was of the very finest linen. Then she gathered together the money into this, and was rich all the days of her life. End. The Star Money by Grimm's Fairy Tale, read by Suzabelle.
The Straw, the Coal, and the Bean by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. In a village dwelt a poor old woman who had gathered together a dish of beans and wanted to cook them. So she made a fire on her hearth, and that it might burn the quicker, she lighted it with a handful of straw. When she was emptying the beans into the pan, one dropped without her observing it, and lay on the ground beside a straw. And soon afterwards, a burning coal from the fire leapt down to the two. Then the straw began and said, "Dear friends, from whence do you come here?" The coal replied, "I fortunately sprang out of the fire, and if I had not escaped by sheer force, my death would have been certain. I should have been burnt to ashes." The bean said, "I too have escaped with a whole skin, but if the old woman had got me into the pan, I should have been made into broth without any mercy, like my comrades." "And would a better fate have fallen to my lot?" said the straw. "The old woman has destroyed all my brethren in fire and smoke. She seized 60 of them at once, and took their lives. I luckily slipped through her fingers." "But what are we to do now?" said the coal. "I think," answered the bean, "that as we have so fortunately escaped death, we should keep together like good companions, and lest a new mischance should overtake us here, we should go away together, and repair to a foreign country." The proposition pleased the two others, and they set out on their way together. Soon, however, they came to a little brook, and as there was no bridge or footplank, they did not know how they were to get over it. The straw hit on a good idea, and said, "I will lay myself straight across, and then you can walk over me as on a bridge." The straw therefore stretched itself from one bank to the other, and the coal, who was of an impetuous disposition, tripped quite boldly onto the newly built bridge. But when she had reached the middle, and heard the water rushing beneath her, she was, after all, afraid, and stood still, and ventured no farther. The straw, however, began to burn, broke in 2 pieces, and fell into the stream. The coal slipped after her, hissed when she got into the water, and breathed her last. The bean, who had prudently stayed behind on the shore, could not but laugh at the event, was unable to stop, and laughed so heartily that she burst. It would have been all over with her, likewise, if, by good fortune, a tailor who was travelling in search of work had not sat down to rest by the brook. As he had a compassionate heart, he pulled out his needle and thread and sewed it together. The bean thanked him most prettily, but as the tailor used black thread, all beans since then have a black seam. End of The Straw, the Coal, and the Bean by the Brothers Grimm.
The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off, with a hop, skip, and a jump, to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffetees. I once bought a pair at a bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the bank of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who has got your clothes?" Peter replied, "The scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden," and described how he had been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped that it would rain. At this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard inside the rabbit hole, calling, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more chamomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam-o'-shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence as the bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with lettuces. They left a great many old little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam-o'-shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half the onions. Little Benjamin said that it was not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly towards the other end of the garden. They went along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently Peter let the pocket handkerchief go again. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. This is what those little rabbits saw round that corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then in half a minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket, because it was quite dark and because the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatsoever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall onto the top of the cat and coughed it off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with the little switch. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned half an hour later, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling, with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. The End. End of the Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. Read by Rachel Stoughton.
The Three Brothers by Grimm's Fairy Tales. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There was once a man who had 3 sons, and nothing else in the world but the house in which he lived in. Now each of the sons wished to have the house after his father's death, but the father loved them all alike and did not know what to do. He did not wish to sell the house, because it had belonged to his forefathers, else he might have divided the money amongst them. At last a plan came into his head, and he said to his sons, "Go into the world and try each of you to learn a trade. When you all come back, he who makes the best masterpiece shall have the house." The sons were well content with this, and the eldest determined to be a blacksmith, the second a barber, and the third a fencing master. They fixed a time when they should all come home again, and then each went his own way. It chanced that they all found skillful masters, who taught them their trades well. The blacksmith had to shoe the king's horses, and he thought to himself, "The house is mine, without a doubt." The barber shaved only great people, and he too already looked upon the house as his own. The fencing master got many a blow, but he only bit his lip and let nothing vex him. "For," he said to himself, "if you are afraid of a blow, you'll never win the house." When the appointed time had gone by, the 3 brothers came back home to their father, but they did not know how to find the best opportunity for showing their skill, so they sat down and consulted together. As they were sitting thus, all at once a hare came running across the field. "Aha, just in time," said the barber. So he took his basin and soap and lathered away until the hair came up. Then he soaped and shaved off the hare's whiskers, whilst he was running at the top of his speed, and did not even cut his skin or injure a hair on his body. "Well done," said the old man. "Your brothers will have to exert themselves wonderfully, or the house will be yours." Soon after, up came a nobleman in his coach, dashing along at full speed. "Now you shall see what I can do, father," said the blacksmith. So away he ran after the coach, took all 4 shoes off the feet of one of the horses whilst he was galloping, and put on 4 new shoes without stopping him. "You are a fine fellow, and as clever as your brother," said the father. "I do not know to which I ought to give the house." Then the 3rd son said, "Father, let me have my turn, if you please." And as it was beginning to rain, he drew his sword and flourished it backward and forward above his head so fast that not a drop fell upon him. It rained still harder and harder, till at last it came down in torrents. But he only flourished his sword faster and faster, and remained as dry as if he were sitting in a house. When his father saw this, he was amazed and said, "This is the masterpiece. The house is yours." His brothers were satisfied with this, as was agreed beforehand. And as they loved one another very much, they all 3 stayed together in the house, followed their trades, and as they had learned them so well and were so clever, they earned a great deal of money. Thus they lived together happily until they grew old, and at last, when one of them fell sick and died, the 2 others grieved so sorely about it that they also fell ill, and soon after died. And because they had been so clever and had loved one another so much, they were all laid in the same grave. End of The 3 Brothers by Grimm's Fairy Tales, read by Suzabelle.
The 3 Heads of the Well, edited by Andrew Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The 3 Heads of the Well. Long before Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, there reigned in the eastern part of England a king who kept his court at Colchester. In the midst of all his glory, his queen died, leaving behind her an only daughter, about 15 years of age, who, for her beauty and kindness, was the wonder of all who knew her. But the king, hearing of a lady who had likewise an only daughter, had a mind to marry her for the sake of her riches, though she was old, ugly, hook-nosed, and humpbacked. Her daughter was a yellow dowdy, full of envy and ill nature, and, in short, was much of the same mould as her mother. But in a few weeks the king, attended by the nobility and gentry, brought his deformed bride to the palace, where the marriage rites were performed. She had not been long in the court before she set the king against his own beautiful daughter by false reports. The young princess, having lost her father's love, grew weary of the court, and one day, meeting with her father in the garden, she begged him with tears in her eyes to let her go and seek her fortune, to which the king consented, and ordered her mother-in-law to give her what she pleased. She went to the queen, who gave her a canvas bag of brown bread and hard cheese, with a bottle of beer. Though this was but a pitiful dowry for a king's daughter, she took it with thanks, and proceeded on her journey, passing through groves and woods and valleys, till at length she saw an old man sitting on a stone at the mouth of a cave, who said, "Good morrow, fair maiden, whither away so fast?" "Aged father," says she, "I am going to seek my fortune." "What have you got in your bag and bottle?" "In my bag I have got bread and cheese, and in my bottle good small beer. Would you like to have some?" "Yes," said he, "with all my heart." With that the lady pulled out her provisions, and bade him eat and welcome. He did so, and gave her many thanks, and said, "There is a thick thorny hedge before you, which you cannot get through, but take this wand in your hand, strike it 3 times, and say, 'Pray, hedge, let me come through,' and it will open immediately. Then, a little further, you will find a well. Sit down on the brink of it, and there will come up 3 golden heads, which will speak, and whatever they require, that do." Promising she would, she took her leave of him. Coming to the hedge, and using the old man's wand, it divided and led her through. Then, coming to the well, she had no sooner sat down than a golden head came up, saying, "Wash me and comb me, and lay me down softly, and lay me down on a bank to dry, that I may look pretty when somebody passes by." "Yes," said she, and taking it in her lap, combed it with a silver comb, and then placed it upon a primrose bank. Then up came a second and a third head, saying the same as the former. So she did the same for them, and then, pulling out her provisions, sat down to eat her dinner. Then said the heads one to another, "What shall we weird for this damsel who has used us so kindly?" The first said, I weird her to be so beautiful that she shall charm the most powerful prince in the world. The second said, I weird her such a sweet voice as shall far exceed the nightingale. The third said, My gift shall be none of the least, as she is a king's daughter. I'll weird her so fortunate that she shall become queen to the greatest prince that reigns. She then let them down into the well again, and so went on her journey. She had not travelled long before she saw a king hunting in the park with his nobles. She would have avoided him, but the king, having caught a sight of her, approached, and what with her beauty and sweet voice, fell desperately in love with her, and soon induced her to marry him. This king, finding that she was the king of Colchester's daughter, ordered some chariots to be got ready, that he might pay the king his father-in-law a visit. The chariot in which the king and queen rode was adorned with rich gems of gold. The king, her father, was at first astonished that his daughter had been so fortunate, till the young king let him know of all that had happened. Great was the joy at court amongst all, with the exception of the queen and her club-footed daughter, who were ready to burst with envy. The rejoicings, with feasting and dancing, continued many days. Then at length they returned home with the dowry her father gave her. The hump-backed princess, perceiving that her sister had been so lucky in seeking her fortune, wanted to do the same, so she told her mother, and all preparations were made, and she was furnished with rich dresses, and with sugar, almonds, and sweetmeats, in great quantities, and a large bottle of Malaga sack. With these she went the same road as her sister, and coming near the cave, the old man said, Young woman, whither so fast? What's that to you? Said she. Then, said he, what have you in your bag and bottle? She answered, Good things which you shall not be troubled with. Won't you give me some? Said he. No, not a bit nor a drop, unless it would choke you. The old man frowned, saying, Evil fortune attend thee. Going on, she came to the hedge, through which she espied a gap, and thought to pass through it, but the hedge closed, and the thorns ran into her flesh, so that it was with great difficulty that she got through. Being now all over blood, she searched for water to wash herself, and looking round she saw the well. She sat down on the brink of it, and one of the heads came up, saying, Wash me, comb me, and lay me down softly, as before. But she banged it with her bottle, saying, Take that for your washing. So the second and third heads came up, and met with no better treatment than the first. Whereupon the heads consulted among themselves what evils to plague her with for such usage. The first said, Let her be struck with leprosy in her face. The second, Let her voice be as harsh as a corncake's. The third said, Let her have for a husband but a poor country cobbler. Well, on she went till she came to a town, and it being market day, the people looked at her, and seeing such an ugly face, and hearing such a squeaky voice, all fled but a poor country cobbler. Now he not long before had mended the shoes of an old hermit, who, having no money, gave him a box of ointment for the cure of the leprosy, and a bottle of spirits for a harsh voice. So the cobbler, having a mind to do an act of charity, was induced to go up to her and ask her who she was. I am, said she, the king of Colchester's daughter-in-law. Well, said the cobbler, if I restore you to your natural complexion, and make a sound cure both in face and voice, will you in reward take me for a husband? Yes, friend, replied she, with all my heart. With this the cobbler applied the remedies, and they made her well in a few weeks, after which they were married, and so set forward for the court at Colchester. When the queen found that her daughter had married nothing but a poor cobbler, she hanged herself in wrath. The death of the queen so pleased the king, who was glad to get rid of her so soon, that he gave the cobbler 100 pounds to quit the court with his lady, and take to a remote part of the kingdom, where he lived many years mending shoes, his wife spinning the thread for him. End of the 3 Heads of the Well.